All right, so in this second video, we're going to look at racial inequality today and think about history and how history informs the inequality we see in contemporary society. So we're going to start with the issue of housing segregation. And we want to start from the outset by asking, when we think about racial problems, we want to think about whose problem are they? And why does something like segregation why is this not seen as a social problem today, even though it's very much a problem? And we want to think about how these effects spiral outwards. But we always want to also think about how do we as a society frame this as a problem? So when we think about the phrase Black Lives Matter, for example, and people say all lives matter in response, part of what they're not thinking about is where are people starting from? And how do we move forward on these issues? So let's start with segregation. One way we measure this is through neighborhood diversity. So this is the racial makeup of different neighborhoods by racial group. And immediately something should be pretty clear that white people live almost entirely with other white people in their neighborhood. Black folks live in much more diverse neighborhoods, though are mostly exposed to other black folks. Asian folks are exposed to a lot of other people in their neighborhood, but these neighborhoods are not very diverse. But mostly, it's important to look at here that white people tend to live with other white people. Another way we look at this is through exposure indices. This is very much the same idea, but what we're looking at is who are you likely to be exposed to throughout your day. So once again, we see that for white folks, by and large, they live in and move and encounter very white spaces. This is in Augusta, Georgia. And so this is another measure of segregation. And so I don't live in a particularly white neighborhood, but if you drive up the hill in Augusta, Georgia to the Hill neighborhood, you walk around, you go to the shops there. There's a little area of shops in the little off like linear road. You will see mostly white people. You go to the store, you go to the restaurant, and you go back home. You could walk the whole time. You'll probably still see mostly white folks if you're white. This is because white folks tend to live around and interact primarily with other white people. While as other racial groups, they tend to see a lot of white folks too because there are just more white people, but not nearly as highly segregated as whites. Though we might note that Asians are pretty close, Asian Americans. All right, so why does segregation matter? Well, first we need to think through why are segregation and wealth connected. So income is what we earn on a daily basis. We covered this in the last section. Wealth is the stock of assets owned. And primarily the way we measure wealth is through net worth. Compared to Black and Hispanic groups in our society, whites on average have much higher net worth in terms of their wealth. The average or mean is around $800,000. The median is closer to $160,000 for the average white household. Now, notice how stark the difference is here. What this tells us is that if we looked at a chart here, the average is taking up everyone in a group, adding them together, and then dividing them by the number. What this high average net worth tells us is that there's more people on the white end who are very, very wealthy. And what they do is they drag up that average. So if it's you and I and Morris in a class, and I make 45, you make 20,000, he makes 30,000. We add that all together, we're going to get something close to like 30,000. But if we then throw in somebody who makes $10 million and we divide it by 4, the average is going to be something like, I don't know, 5 million. Right? So those outliers drag up the white average. The median is just the middle point, and so we still note that white median net worth is much higher than every other racial group. So how do we think about this? Why is this the case? Right? How can we think about this historically? In our society, we tend to tell a story that people work hard for what they get, but what about the people who worked hard before them? Right? History is very important here. Wealth builds up over time. It's generational. And so if we think back to the founding history of our country, when we talk about something like reparations, this is why we're talking about that sort of thing. Just imagine there's a group of black men and women who are hustling, they're working, and they're working for a white landowner or slave owner. Right? And so maybe they're working in the fields, they're working in a banana plantation, and they don't have the right to anything that they produce. They don't have the right to their work. And so over time, as they work, they make more stuff. All of that stuff is owned by this plantation owner. And it builds up and it builds up. And sure, he might have to take a little bit of that wealth and feed some of them, but all of that produce, all of that labor goes in his hands. He owns it and they don't own anything. And he can then sell that. That gives him more wealth, and the slaves cannot do anything with that. Maybe he buys a house with that money or a larger plantation. Then once he pays it off with more of the fruits of those other folks' labor, the brown and black folks, then he owns that house. That is his. And when he has a little white child, he can pass it on to that child. The child doesn't have to buy it again. They own it. So wealth is like this. Wealth is generational. I, for example, have some amount of money in stock my mother left me that she left untouched for that particular purpose. And if I want to get a car or maybe even put a down payment on a house, I can draw on some of that money if I want to. So this is one of the reasons why whiteness and wealth are connected. Of course, we still see persistent hourly income inequality, meaning that for the same job, black folks are paid less. And this is a continual trend. How does this happen? Well, this is built into labor markets. This is built into the processes of hiring. So when the employer asks to look at your previous pay or at comparable pay in other firms versus seeing what your skills are based on. Right? And the wage gap is actually growing over time, not shrinking. We also see strong inequalities in education. So what we want to pay attention to in terms of trends here are the gaps. We see an overall upward pattern in GPA for all groups. But we notice the gaps are pretty persistent. They change and fluctuate, but they're still achievement gaps for all groups. Average GPA for black folks is 2.6, for white 3.9, and for Asians 3.26. We should note that within these racial groups, different ethnic groups are treated very differently. So Vietnamese people, Hmong people are treated very differently and often have different effects. So how is inequality in education created? Here is where differential treatment by teachers or differential funding in schools becomes really important. Where are public schools funded? Most of their funding comes from property taxes, in fact, local property taxes. So if we go back to thinking about that wealth inequality, the average household, an average house in a white family is going to be worth more. So when we think about funding for schools, that means that if you're in a predominantly white neighborhood, that you're going to have more of a tax base and thus more funding for your schools. Right? And again, this continuing segregation is kept up through issues of white flight, gentrification, and through outright racist lending practices. People might move out if black families move in white neighborhoods, or it might happen in the real estate process. Real estate lenders are known, for example, not to show certain houses or apartments to families based on their race. So when we think back to how segregation spirals outwards, um, simply being black means that your house is valued less because of your race. And so if you're in a more black community, there is less money in your housing, which means you are taxed less, which means the value of your property doesn't generate as many taxes. And not only does it affect schooling, but it also makes it hard to build wealth over time because black wealth is treated differently. And if you followed Watchmen or any of the history, you'd know that when black wealth has been accumulated historically, it's also been destroyed by white folks in power. Here we tend to see that 6-year outcomes that white people tend to, more than other groups, complete at the institution they start at, much more than other racial groups. Again, we want to think about how does this happen? How is it, well, why do black folks have a more difficult time completing at their degree, as well as Hispanic and Latinx folks? And again, we know that degrees bring more wealth and income and more chance of success, but we also know that that it's difficult to get to the degree, and that's the key problem, right? That for non-white groups and non-Asian groups, it's harder to get there. One way we can again see this happening is through treatment by teachers. At suspensions and expulsions, for example, a day suspended out of school can definably impact your GPA. And what we see here is that while black students make up around 20% of total enrollment, they make up almost 50% of all suspensions and 46% of expulsion. And we've all seen videos of officers in schools treating students differently, treating them violently. This kind of treatment, so not only does being expelled or thrown out impact your academic performance, but it also affects the psyche and well-being of the student. Simply put, if you're treated like a criminal, you start to feel like you are one. In the same way that if you're treated like you're not smart, you may start to believe that. And we see this affect student performance. One supplement I'll put up is the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment. And if you just watch the first 10 minutes of it, you will see that when students are treated differently by their teacher in this experiment, their performance on their tests, their verbal tests, go down. So we need to look at how teachers are treating their students, and many teachers probably aren't even conscious of it.